Hello, Plaidman here. Public service announcement. Don't be butthole. Don't be a hole of the butt. Because everything that comes out of you is just gross. Maybe necessary, but gross. It is a removal of things not needed by the body. Don't be butthole. Okay? Instead, be other things. Don't be butthole. Just think about it. All right, joking aside, Plaidman here. So you wanna? uh, so much things to talk about, but the thing I want to talk about today that came up that I thought was interesting, without all the backstory on it. Well, I'll give a little backstory. So I was intending on buying a little bit of property, empty lot, and going through the rigmarole and stuff and things. And I was doing yard work down the street. So that didn't work out. Like, it got sold to somebody else. Fine. Cool. Whatever. Bygones be bygones. And I'm doing some yard work down the street for monies. And I'm about to leave. And I drive down. And hey, what do you know? The person who bought the property and the person who I just did yard work for the week prior. And we're talking about stuff and things. And primarily what the discussion was about was his now new next door neighbor. So where he moved, the person who's next to him, and how much of a bitch this person is. And it was fascinating and frustrating. Because in a weird way, I felt like I dodged a bullet. But not really. I would have enjoyed the challenge. But the other part of me was... it kept hammering into this concept of it not to be that person, not to be what we call now a Karen, somebody who complains and whines about everything to the authorities instead of talking to their neighbors. And I feel like, in general, perhaps humanity can be reminded, and I'm not trying to point to any particular person or whatever, I'm pointing to this person in particular, I'm not giving her name, as much as I'd like to, that don't be that person. Don't be the Karen of your neighborhood. Don't be a Karen in general. Like, mind your own business. Be courteous to your neighbors. If you don't like something, talk to them. And that's kind of like the fundamental thing that this whole conversation really propagated and suggested, which is like, look, if you have an issue, if you see something, and say something, but not necessarily to the authorities. Like, you can communicate to your neighbor, hey, bro, like, it's kind of weird. And I've run into this in different places where, like, the next door neighbor has, like, garbage all over their yard. Now, you could talk to the neighbor. You can, like, go knock on their door. It's allowed. You're allowed to do that. And if they tell you to politely skedoodle away or impolitely to F off, well, then that's one thing. Then you can escalate it to another handling. And frankly, I don't know if the laws say that they can have a mess on their yard or not. Maybe it's a fire hazard. I don't know. Every problem requires its own solution. But what I find fascinating is it seemed to me, and I've done a lot of like listening to different people's tales on this particular person. It seems to me that every step of the way she is manipulative and just shady and not a good person, and kind of does things the way that she wants them done. An example would be she hired a bunch of guys, people who work, are outside of Home Depot, to build a fence for her. And basically she shortchanged them at the end because they didn't know how to install like the thing to move her fence back and forth, the engine, which in all fairness, I build fences for a living. I do that for, it's my current job. That's something I don't even know how to do. I could maybe figure it out, but my boss usually figures out, and he's done it for 20 years, on and off. Like, he's done it. He has experience. So hiring a bunch of guys who probably none of them collectively have a year of experience doing that particular thing, and all that is whatever. But at the end of the day, supposedly how the story goes is that at the end of the day, she was like, cool, I'm going to pay you less because you guys weren't able to do this. And I agree to pay you this much if you did the fence plus this. And since you couldn't do this, I'm going to pay you less. Now, I can understand her perspective of, this was what I wanted and you couldn't do that. However, it's a really bad vibe. Like, it invokes a certain type of thing. And that story, along with dozens and maybe a couple dozen stories of her kind of doing things like that are counterintuitive to surviving well and getting along well with your neighbors, leaves a very sour taste in the mouth. And in my opinion, will eventually, hit her back. So, aside from all that, don't be that person. I think it's better to be a person who is a friend. Communicate with your neighbors when you can. Like, hey, how you doing? Yada, yada. You don't have to get involved in all their personal stuff. But with my next door neighbor, I talked to her about a few things. And then one day I was outside having a cigarette. And she was like, hey, can you, hi, I need help. Blah, blah, blah. And so she just needed help taking her dog out of the car into her house. And there's been a few other times, and we've talked to her about some other stuff. And I don't have to know her whole life and be immersed in her whole thing, but it should be okay for your neighbors to be like, hey, do you need help? What's going on? Yada, yada. Or I need help. Because if you think about this, and I've been thinking about this, so I'm passing on this infection to you. What if you're gone at work for 8 hours and there's a fire? You want the people around you to be willing to go into your house to grab any animals that are there and pull them out. Now, firefighters will do it, but they may not get there for 5-10 minutes. You want the people who live next to you to care enough about you to be willing to do that. Most people will do that in general, because they're good people. But if you're an asshat to them, then that moment of hesitation might cost you your favorite loved one because you were an asshat. So I feel like that permeates just beyond your house, whether it's your work environment or whatever. I think it's something looking into. I'm not trying to tell people how to live your life. However, it's something like this person is stuck out. And I have, story time, a situation where I was living in Pasadena with my parents. And we've been living there for 20 odd years. And our next door neighbor, consistently, not quite as bad as this lady, but consistently would bring up stuff and complaints. Silly things like, oh, our trash cans are visible from the street. That's not allowed. Now, that's true. The law states in Pasadena, you can't have the trash cans visible from the street unless you put them out on the street. So it's like, okay, that's fine. But instead of communicating to us, she involved the authorities, and then basically we'd be fined or have a warning if we didn't fix it. And it was like a laundry list of things like that over years. Like one was, we are working on a vehicle on the street in front of our own house, and the police came by because she called them to say, sorry, you can't work on this vehicle in front of your own house. You have to only work on it in your driveway. Okay, I get it. I understand, fluids and stuff like that. But it was such a silly thing. And it wasn't like we had a cadre of cars in front of our house. It was this one-off situation where we're like, hey, our driveway's slanted. We'd prefer something a little more level so we could better work on the Suburban. But it didn't matter. She didn't come out and talk to us about it. She just called the authorities. And it's a weird thing. And I feel like people need to realize, and perhaps people need to be reminded of, hey, there might be a time when there is no authorities. So you need to start acting accordingly. You need to start having the idea of, what if there was no one to report to? how would you solve this problem? And frankly, I think that's a good, solid thing to think about is how would you solve the problem in general? Like, you don't get to use outside, like, let me call the police or what's the lifeline? Like, no, you have to solve the problem. How would you do that? And I think that's something to think about. And I think too many, we currently are in a society where too many people depend on the establishment to protect them. And I think now is way past the time to start thinking, how would I solve this without the government, without the establishment, without some other authority? And I think that's a valuable thing to start learning. If you don't know how to do it, you should start learning. And it starts with just communication. Communication, affinity, and reality. If you don't have any of those, start with one of them, build it until you can build the other one, build it, and have the third one, and then all three of them, and just maintain them. That's it. Communication, reality, affinity. Affinity, reality, communication. That's it. If you start with that at any point, usually communication's easier. I think you'll find it isn't that hard to have some sort of repertoire, conversation with your neighbors. Anyways, that's it for now. Plaidman out. My head is on fire right now because it is so warm. But I love you all. Plaidman out. Bye-bye.